And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome aboard, and this is your Alaska Marine Weather Outlook. I'm meteorologist Peter Chan, coming to you from the National Weather Service in Alaska region on this Wednesday, June 4th, 2025. And we start with the state of the sea ice in the far north. We have still a bit of ice along areas, especially the east and northeast side of St. Lawrence Island there in the vicinity of Savunga. We also have a fair amount of ice in the lower Chukchi Sea, but there are openings there, especially north of the Bering Strait, and these larger openings are polynias along the area of the Lisburn Peninsula to off of Point Lay and Wainwright all the way to Utqiagvik. Still a fair amount of ice there across the Beaufort Sea coast between Utqiagvik and Kaktovik. And as I said, it's been a slow process to have this melt off and break up here. It's been below normal in terms of temperatures over the North Slope and along the Arctic coast. And in fact, we have another a band of accumulating snow that'll set up along the spine of the Brooks Range as we head through later tonight, and certainly Thursday into Friday. Several inches of snow could fall there up along the Dalton Highway, especially in the vicinity of Adigan Pass and Anatuvik passes. But later tonight and into Thursday morning, we've had one low now. It's come up across on the east side here at Kodiak Island, and it's going to pull back toward Prince William Sound and weaken tonight. Into the day on Thursday, the frontal system coming gradually north and eastward is also weakening, more of a wind shift or trough. There are going to be some gale warnings at least through late tonight along the northeastern Gulf Coast outside of Yakutat Bay, and those winds will come down a bit as we head through, certainly on Thursday. And then what we're watching coming up here, so here's Thursday afternoon. We just have lingering weaker low pressure back toward the west end of Prince William Sound, northern Kenai Peninsula, with this trough pushing on up into the inner channels of the Panhandle. Here comes the next low. This is a gale force low. It actually has a little stronger wind field around it, and as that heads northeastward, it's going to be pulling up into the west side here of the Gulf in a similar track for later Friday night during the day on Saturday. And this system will likely bring some gale force winds along this region of the Gulf, as I said, late Friday night and Saturday. And here it is Friday afternoon. We find at least things a little bit of ridging causes a little more tranquil weather in through the Panhandle along the Gulf Coast Friday. There could be a few lingering light showers along coastal areas. But this push of milder air that's going to come up at least into the southern Panhandle, that low is going to take a track to just off the Kodiak Island coastline to right up in this region here between the southern end of the Kenai Peninsula and Kodiak City. And so as we go into Thursday, winds will be southerly, inner channels 20 knots, could gust as high as 35 knots there within Lynn Canal. Waves running on the order of 4 to locally as high as 5 feet out there at Ketchikan, Metlakatla. For the outer coast, southwest winds 15 to 20 knots from off of Craig, Port Alexander, Sitka. Swells 8 feet as we go upward from outside of Cross Sound to south of Yakutat. South winds 15 to 20 knots before turning easterly at 15 knots around Cape Suckling. And then for Friday, look for south winds for Lynn Canal and Stevens Passage, waves 2 to 3 feet with those 15-knot south winds. A little bit more of a westerly wind down here around Ketchikan and Metlakatla, which will keep waves to maybe a couple of feet. Same thing off of Prince of Wales Island, off Craig there, west winds 15 knots, swells up to 6 feet. And then generally southerly winds off of Port Alexander, Sitka, outside of Cross Sound, and Yakutat Bay at 10 to 15 knots, 6-7 foot swells. Winds for Thursday across Lower Cook Inlet and along the eastern Kenai will be generally westerly at 25 knots, waves 7 feet or so, Lower Cook Inlet, especially south of Anchor Point. And then off the Kenai coast, 9-footers and even outside of Hinchinbrook entrance. Within Prince William Sound, winds should come down because that weak low is just kind of lag in this region. So we're looking somewhat variable winds there in Prince William Sound. But by Thursday afternoon could become southwesterly at 10 knots with waves a couple of feet. So that's some of the better conditions there in the past couple of few days. And then winds Friday are going to go around to the east out over the Gulf here in the nearshore waters of the Gulf. Outside of Hinchinbrook entrance, Kayak Island east 25 to 30 knots, and easterly winds off the eastern Kenai and northeast of Kodiak Island. Cook Inlet, southeast winds to 15 knots on Friday, waves a couple of feet, and then lower Cook Inlet, a bit of a variable mixed bag of winds. South-southwest 10 to 15 knots, upper Cook Inlet down to off of Anchor Point, and then more of an easterly wind into Kamishak Bay there on Friday afternoon with waves 3-4 feet. Winds across from Kodiak Island down across the Alaska Peninsula, generally a westerly component, 25 knots in the vicinity of Kodiak Island, and then west-northwest winds 15-20 knots on the North Pacific side. And winds within Bristol Bay as high as 25 knots, trailing off to 15 knots north of Cold Bay. On Friday, winds will be northeasterly, strongest off of the east side of Kodiak Island and east of Chiknik. Look for northeast to north winds to 30 knots. And those winds will turn more northwesterly, especially along the Bering side of the peninsula, even a bit variable between Port Hayden and Cold Bay, but waves running there too, maybe 4 feet, with a little higher waves there east of Chiknik, upwards of 7 to as high as 8 feet along the Kenai or the Kodiak Island coast. Now, winds are going to be lighter and more variable across the Aleutians Thursday. We have generally northwest winds to 15 knots around Dutch Harbor on Alaska. But once we get west of Nikolsky through Atka, Adak, all the way back to Kiska and Shemya, we're looking at variable winds, generally only around 10 knots, thanks to a weak area of high pressure along and south there of the western half of the Aleutians. And then for Friday, winds do pick up and turn more westerly across the eastern half of the Aleutians. Look for west winds 20 to 25 knots, but those winds become more southerly west of Adak, especially up to Kiska and Shemya. Look for southerly winds to 20 knots. Now, along the southwest coast, all the way from Norton Sound down into Bristol Bay and Kuskokwim Bays, look for westerly winds of 20 knots on Thursday, waves 3-4 feet. St. Matthew could have west winds to 25 knots with 4-foot waves, and then the Pribilof, St. Paul, St. George, westerly winds 15 knots with waves of 4 feet. For Friday, winds still westerly, come down to 15 knots within Kuskokwim and Bristol Bays. Those winds westerly 20 knots out towards St. Paul and St. George, more northerly 15 knots at St. Matthew. And then up along the lower Yukon coast and Norton Sound, especially that wider expanse between Nome and Emonic. This area here, north to northwest winds 10 to 15 knots, waves 2 to 3 feet on Friday. For the lower Chukchi Sea and coming on through the Bering Strait for Thursday, winds will be north-northwest around 20 knots, especially along the west side of the Seward Peninsula at Wales and Port Clarence, maybe only 10 knots as you get further west toward Gamble. And then up along the Cape Lisburne, Point Hope, see winds northeasterly to 25 knots, but otherwise, generally speaking, from north of Point Lay through Wainwright, Utqiagvik to Prudhoe Bay, winds will be out of the northeast at 10 to 15 knots. And then for Friday, winds will have a northerly component along the Beaufort Sea coast, 5 to 10 knots, so not very strong at all. And then as we drop down through the Chukchi Sea, generally north winds 15 to 20 knots as you get off of Cape Lisburne, Point Hope, and down through the Bering Strait. And along the west side of St. Lawrence Island for Friday, winds will generally be northerly at 20 knots with 15-knot north winds there on the north side of St. Lawrence Island.